All right, guys, today we're covering Standard 3.4, which has to do with how Reconstruction ends. We're getting pretty close to the end of the chapter at this point. Specifically, what we're going to talk about today is how the end of Reconstruction happens and how it impacts African Americans in the South. So, just a little recap. We've been trying to put the Union back together after the Civil War. That's what Reconstruction is. And we've had troops down in the South because the Congress was in control of Reconstruction. And the South really hated what was going on. So how's it going to end? When's Congress going to decide to give up? Well, it's a little complicated. The idea is that Congress gets tired of trying to enforce these policies in the South that the South doesn't want. Congress has other things they want to do. They've been trying to settle the West or encourage people to settle the West. There's been an economic depression in the North. Grant, who you see over here on the right, is a good guy, but his administration is very corrupt. He has a lot of people in there who are skimming money off the top, using their offices for personal gain. And Congress has got to worry about all this stuff. On top of that, every time you hear something about the South, people say, see, look, the South is still hanging African Americans. They're still not allowing equality. So the South is never going to change. So why are we bothering? They just don't care to keep enforcing these policies. So over time, Congress says, let's focus on things other than rights for the freedmen. And so they're going to focus on other things. Now, the ability to stop worrying about these things comes in 1876, where you have these two guys running for president. On the left, you have a Republican. His name is Rutherford B. Hayes. On the right, you've got a Democrat whose name is Tilden. Now, neither of these guys are particularly friendly with the South. The South, both of them believe that there shouldn't be slavery. They believe the South is wrong, all this stuff. So the South doesn't really care. But because they hate Republicans, the South votes overwhelmingly for Samuel Tilden anyway. Now, when all the ballots are counted, it looks like Samuel Tilden has probably won this election. He has a couple more electors than Rutherford B. Hayes. But the winner is not entirely clear. The South decides that they would be willing to change their votes to make things a little more clear. They would be willing to change the electors they send from people voting for Tilden to people voting for Rutherford B. Hayes if, they say, the Union troops would be removed from the South. So one more time, here's what they say. They don't care about whether they get the Democrat or Republican because they don't like them both. They tell the Republicans, we'll vote for your guy and let you guys have the presidency if you promise to take troops out of the South. We call this the Compromise of 1877. And the Republicans say, good deal, let's go for it. But the problem is, this leaves the African Americans in the South to fend for themselves. Nobody's looking out for it. So because of this deal, we call 1877 the end of Reconstruction. The Compromise of Reconstruction effectively ends Reconstruction in the South. We say the South is now back into the Union, and the South can do whatever it wants to do. So what was accomplished with Reconstruction? Not a whole lot. Think about this. Without troops, what are white Southerners going to do to the black people in the South? I'll give you a hint. If you look over at the political cartoon, you've got the white guys shaking hands with the Klan, also a white guy, presumably. And the agreement is we're going to keep these guys in a situation worse than slavery. You've got hanging. They're burning down the schoolhouses. Things are really, really bad now. Who's going to enforce the 13th and 14th Amendments? Who's going to enforce the freedom from slavery and the equal protection under the law that the 14th Amendment gives, or the 15th Amendment voting rights for all male citizens regardless of color? Nobody. So we did some note cards in class. Don't worry about that. So now with the white people gone, or not the white people gone, with the army gone, you can have people like the Klan start to intimidate black people away from voting. So the army's gone. You get groups like the Klan tell black people, if you vote, we will hang you, we will beat you, we will do whatever. So black people stop voting in the South. Okay? And because of that, white people vote for Democrats because they're the ones who have allowed the South to have these Jim Crow laws, which we're going to see in a bit, and to have the black codes. They say, we want this. So they claim that, these Democrats claim they're going to redeem or take back Southern governments, like even in South Carolina, I hate to say, from the African Americans who'd been in office and the Republicans. Because remember, when the black people voted, they voted for black people, they voted for Republicans. And now you get people who are taking it back or redeeming it and saying, nope, no more of that. Okay, so these are the redeemers. Did I skip something? No. So with the Democrats in power, most states start to pass laws that we know now as the Jim Crow laws. These are laws that require separate facilities for blacks and whites. So you have separate schools or separate drinking fountains or separate train cars. Basically, this is going to be passed in pretty much every single southern state. Now, the guy over here on the right is a man by the name of Homer Plessy, and he probably looks pretty white to you. But Homer Plessy is actually a very small percentage, I forget because I haven't looked recently, but it's like 1/16 black. In other words, his great-grandfather was black. He gets on a train car in Louisiana, and he says to a guy in the white train car, you know, it's a good thing that I look like I do because my great-grandfather, you know, he couldn't have ridden this car, so times have changed. And the guy freaks out. He's like, what do you mean your grandfather couldn't ride in this car? And he says, oh, he was a black man. And so this white guy goes to the conductor and says, hey, there's a guy who's 1/16 black on the train car. You need to get rid of him. So he throws him off the train. Now, Homer Plessy's not an idiot. He wants to be thrown off the train because once this happens, he can sue and he can say, this is discrimination. This is a violation of my 14th Amendment rights. Remember, the 14th Amendment says all people, regardless of race, should get equal protection under the law. Well, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And Homer Plessy says, I got a slam dunk. This is a win. But the Supreme Court says that separation is okay as long as the facilities are equal. This is where we get the phrase separate but equal from Plessy versus Ferguson. This is bad because, as you know from your history, the facilities were never equal when they were separate. The black schools were always the ones that got the old textbooks and the old beat-up furniture and all that stuff. The black train cars are always the ones with fewer amenities. So this is a travesty, but this is what's happening in the South now that there's nobody there to enforce the Reconstruction ideals. Of course, these laws violate the 14th Amendment. That's what we talked about, equal protection. So the federal government's basically abandoned African Americans, and because the Supreme Court under Plessy versus Ferguson says that discrimination is okay, now discrimination is legal. And that's why this picture taken probably in the 1940s and 1950s, that's almost 100 years after Reconstruction, you still have a very similar situation going on in the South. Now, so basically, we've got the black codes, which keep African Americans in a situation a lot like slavery. You have the Jim Crow laws, which basically undo the 14th Amendment because segregation is now legal. The 15th Amendment is the next thing that's going to be under the attack of the South. And the 15th Amendment, if you remember, is the one that's going to tell all males, regardless of race, that they can vote. So the South says, how can we keep them from voting? I know. Black people tend to be poor. So let's have a tax on voting. And now that's not a racist comment. I want to be clear. Black people in the South were poor because they didn't have any education because white people wouldn't let them get educated. They didn't have good jobs because white people wouldn't hire them. Okay, so basically when they put this poll tax on to tax people before they can vote, it does prohibit a number of African Americans from voting. It makes them unable to do it. On top of that, the South very often would have something called literacy tests. In other words, you have to prove that you're intelligent enough to vote. These tests were very, very skewed, though. We actually did one in class, as most of you will remember if you were here. The one we did in class, it's very skewed. You can look at almost any question on it, and it could go either way. Like, should I answer this or should I answer this? There are multiple correct answers. It all depended on, were you white or were you black? And if you were white, the person grading it would say, yep, good enough, you did it perfect, you can vote. But if you're black, not so much. The political cartoon here, you see the white guy writing, the black man ought to be educated before he can vote with us whites. But he's spelling it all wrong. The point being, he's an idiot, so why should he vote? Okay. So clearly we have some issues. So what does happen if you are, like this guy in the cartoon, you're too uneducated to vote, but you're white? Well, they passed this thing called the grandfather clause, which says that if your grandfather could legally vote, you can too, even if you can't pay the poll tax, even if you can't pass the literacy test. So this allows uneducated white people to vote. Now think about that for a second. How does the grandfather clause not help the black people too? Because their grandfathers were slaves. Of course they couldn't vote. So this is definitely discriminatory. So because of this, black people can't vote, and so white Democrats are going to take over the South. They're going to pass more Jim Crow laws, and you get this concept called a solid South. The solid South is an idea that the South votes solidly for Democrats for about 100 years. So because of this, African Americans can't get hired at textile mills or in any other jobs. African Americans are getting poorer and poorer because they don't have any opportunities, and the governments in the South are discriminating against them, and the federal government's not helping. A lot of people start to move north because they think that those are going to be the only opportunities available to them, and they're probably right. We talked about that in class, and that looks like, yep, we got one more very quick concept to cover, and we should be out of here in no time. So, as always, shoot me an email if you have any questions, ngallion@greenmeadowcollege.org, and hopefully this has been a really big help to you. See you next time.